I know what you're thinking. Sweet tea with tacos? It's absurd, right? In our last video, we went over making this bracket to hold the hose on this manifold. This manifold is the same manifold off of a 1G DSM. So why do I have it here with my food? Well, let me explain. But before I do, we have to go back in time to before I needed this. This manifold actually came on the car when I purchased it. At the time of sale, it had a built 6-bolt bottom end as well as a stock top end. The top end was a 7-bolt motor, 7-bolt head with a 7-bolt intake. Originally, this worked fine for me. One day I spun a bearing and I had no choice but to pull the 6-bolt head and block out of my Talon. This brings us back to the 1G manifold. When I dropped it in the car, I had a lot of challenges. The 2G manifold has a couple of provisions that the 1G does not. And looking at it, you can probably see that. Let's take a marker here and count for a second. We have 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. There's a fourth one I'll talk about here in a second. Here's a fifth one. And then in the back, there's a number 6. 6 provisions. This one is for the brake booster. I don't remember what this one's for. I don't remember what that one's for. This one was hooked up to the fuel pressure regulator. This will be for PCV valve. This guy is a MAP sensor, and technically it is a boost source provision from a technical standpoint. The 1G manifold has a couple as well. Now, this one is a non-turbo, so the provisioning is a little bit different. But again, we have 1. We have 2 for the brake booster. Then we have 3. Now, right here and right here, and right here also, we have bosses that are not tapped. We have no barb on them. So this one would be 4, potentially 5, and then potentially 6. Same amount of provisions. Now in the non-turbo, there are certain lines that aren't used. For instance, the blow-off valve. Not necessary. In my case, what I had done was pull out the barb, drill the opening to the correct size for an MPT thread. I threaded each boss to receive an MPT port. There's nothing to keep that line secured, even with the clips on it, even with their zip ties. And when things finally do settle and the seal is made, it's impossible to get these hoses off. Jumping back to the 2G manifold, in the scenario where I blew my motor, things started popping up that I didn't understand what to do with. For instance, this guy. I had nowhere to put him anymore. I didn't know if it was needed because this bracket was different where the coil pack set. I also had wiring issues. I couldn't get things to fit correctly and mount correctly. I ended up stretching my wire harness quite a bit while also letting some of these parts flip around. So what I needed was a way to connect all of the things that the turbo setup needed to this manifold that used to be on this manifold. Now, technically speaking, there is one more hidden port here. We'll come back to it. Needless to say, I did not do this. For a turbo setup on a DSM, you needed a couple of vacuum lines. You need one for your blow-off valve. You need one for your FPR. You also need one for your brake booster. And potentially one for your boost gauge if you're using one. The 2G ECU will be a little upset if you don't have this guy. They do make adapters to seat this into a block for when you do this kind of swap. However, in my case, I'm actually not even using this sensor. Because I have ECM link, I am actually going to use speed density, which requires another vacuum line from me. For the manifold pressure. I'm using this input on the wire harness, but I have nowhere to put it on this manifold. Bear with me, this will all make sense here in a moment, I promise. On my 1G manifold, it was pretty easy to come up with all 5 ports. Again, we had this one open, this one open. We had the brake booster open. I only needed one more. I decided to go ahead and drill this boss open back here. Spin that around. This section right here has plenty of meat and has no problems being tapped straight through and into the main plumbing. Originally, I considered using the PCV nipple. The problem with this is that although the cast has a line that crosses all runners, the signal from this specific barb is choppy. So it actually ends up being less than ideal for this use case. Another thing you could do is use this port. If you're using a block off plate here, you could tap the plate and put a fitting here and use that as a vacuum source. This has its own line that comes all the way up to right behind the throttle body. I did that too. So for our blow-off valve, we're using the EGR port. For the fuel pressure, we are using front 1. For the brake booster, we're using the brake booster. For the boost gauge, we're using front 2. And for the map, we're actually using the rear. That gives me everything I need here, here, and here, and here, and then brake boost. The way this differs from my original setup is where the holes are and how secure some of those holes are. On this manifold, this hole did not exist originally. Now, I know you can't see this here, but there are only 2 threads inside of this. And what I found while practicing my tapping is that it is very easy to destroy those threads, especially in aluminum, which this is. The safer thing to do would be to drill into a boss where there's plenty of meat, which is exactly what I did over here. Just a little bit too much torque on this fitting, and we have a problem. So now that we have ports that are secure and have lots of meat and aren't going anywhere, the next challenge is, how do we connect our sensors and our gauges and our regulators and everything else to the modifications that we made? Well, there are a couple ways of doing this. We could have skipped the fittings altogether and screwed some of these things in, like the boost gauge or the map sensor. Since I am using an AEM map sensor, that would have been a possibility. However, I was concerned about vibration. I don't know how often these things fail due to vibration. What I do know is that it does kill oil pressure transducers, and so I try to stay away from that. Another thing to keep in mind here is this manifold, or rather the ugly twin of this manifold, is not going to be in that car for very long. This was the 6th bolt out of my Talon, and I have full intentions of it going back into the Talon. That means that I can either go back to this manifold or this style of manifold, or I could go to an Evo manifold, or perhaps something else, something third party, like a sheet metal intake. I will have the same question to start with as this guy. How do I get things connected? On any of those manifolds that I don't have, it's just a matter of making the holes, putting the fittings. On this specific manifold, it's pretty much the same story. Pull the barbs out, tap the boss, insert fittings. To clean things up, I opted to use the rigid hard lines to route everything in a clean manner. Not necessary, but I felt like it was a good fit. On this particular fitting, there was not enough clearance between this cap and the edge of the fitting and the hose to turn even by hand, much less with a tool. The best I would have been able to do would be remove the coil packs, tighten everything down, and put them back in, which is a little counterproductive. My goal here was ease, not make life harder. So now that we have an idea of what's going on with the manifolds in our lines, let's talk about the actual sensors and gauges and all these other guys. I mentioned before that I don't really feel great about putting transducers on vibrating parts. It's known to be a problem. Originally, I was going to use what's called a vacuum block. A vacuum block, something like that. I found my true calling. I should have been an artist. The way the vacuum blocks work is you have a port, any of these, they're all connected inside. and you run a line to one of them. For me, I would probably choose here. I'd connect this line to that port, directly or indirectly. And then I could put something like my boost gauge, my blow-off valve, my pressure regulator, and so on. When I brought this up in the Facebook group, I had somebody tell me, well, don't use a vacuum block, use a remote sensor block. And I said, well, what is that? They look the same. This is where I got schooled. After our discussion, I agreed. I bought a 4-port remote sensor block. It looks kind of like that. You've seen it on the car. It's mounted on the firewall. And I have my map sensor. I have my boost gauge, plumbing. I have my fuel pressure regulator. We'll just put, wow, I really messed that up. FPR. Boost gauge. And map sensor. This fourth one is actually not used at the moment. We'll get to that in a second. The difference between these two concepts is right here. On a vacuum manifold, you have one port and you have all this shared space. Whatever vacuum or boost is left at the end of this will be the weakest or slowest to recharge. It would be your worst performing device. It's kind of like when you turn on your shower and then somebody starts the washing machine and your shower pressure changes. It's the same idea, it's a manifold. On a remote block, every one of these has its own space. They do not touch. So my speed density gets a line from the manifold like that. And this is the only place that air can go. It's plugged from the top, input in the front, device on the bottom. And that's it. No air can travel between here. Doesn't happen. And so I have another line that goes to my boost gauge and another and so on. What this allows me to do is to plan ahead for my next swap. We already know it's going to be this intake. I already know I'm going to be running speed density. I already know I'm going to need these items. And when I pull the motor, I don't have to worry about the devices themselves. All I have to worry about is the jumper hose that went from the fitting to the block. And that's it. It's as easy as taking the hose off and pushing it aside. That also means that I don't have to worry about which hose went in what position. They're all the same. They're all about the same length. They're all the same diameter. All I have to do is connect them in such a way that they don't bunch up or kink up. And then I also get the additional benefit of having everything threaded down, so I don't have to worry about hoses popping off or gluing themselves to a barb so that when it is time for them to come off, I'm fighting that. So that's my story on why I did things the way that I did. The remote block on the firewall just gives me a place for devices to hang out without having to worry about plumbing or complicated lines during swaps. The fittings give me a positive locking feature that helps me feel better about things popping off and seizing up. And altogether, I can plan to swap this manifold or that one or use whatever fits and just really not have to think about it. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you found it helpful, give it a like. If you enjoyed having dinner with me, which you basically did, and talking about car stuff, make sure you subscribe. I don't know how often I'll be doing this type of video, but I think it was helpful. Until next time, thanks for watching.